2023 public hearing of the 23-24 Stevens Point School District budget meeting to order. We'll have Carlin take roll.
Mr. Robbie.
Here.
Ms. Portson. Here. Mr. Pope.
Here.
Mr. Summers.
Here.
Ms. Erler.
Here.
Ms. Rano.
Here.
Mr. Kowalski.
Here.
Mr. Campos.
Here.
Ms. Bushman.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to agenda item 3A, we have the presentation of budget overview with Dr. Owens.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to take you on a journey this evening. And I have, first thing I'd like to do, however, I would like to personally thank a couple members of my staff that would play a key role in putting together this budget. Dr. Mike Kurtz, who's seated behind me, and Lynette Patoka, my administrative assistant. This year we've always tried to have a lot of transparency in our budgets and provide information for the public. And this year we decided to expand that to a format that complies with the Association of School Business Officials International in a format called the Meritorious Budget. And that's how this budget document came about. It's 72 pages in total. There's a lot of information in here that hopefully will benefit you folks, as well as anybody in the public that has a copy of this. We will put this document, once it's approved by you in the subsequent meeting, we'll put this online starting tomorrow, so public has 24/7 access to it, as we've done with other budgets. But there's a lot of information here to go over, and I'll highlight some of it with the presentation tonight, and there'll be some things I'll be talking about to provide some edification and clarification of things that are going on that are not contained in this budget but affect the budget directly or indirectly. So let's take a look at the first slide, and this just gives you a breakout of the book itself, and it is divided into 4 sections: the executive summary, the organization section, the financial section, and the informational section. That's the concept behind the book. The executive summary section is designed to be liftable, so it contains a good amount of information that crosses all of these sections. And then the other sections gets into the organization of the district, gets into the financial status of the district, and then there's just a lot of information besides that: student scores, demographics, etc. But let's get down to some of the core things that are probably the most important this evening. This slide, which I've always started this presentation out with, is very key. The tax levy summary, it's found on page 10 of your budget book, is really helpful because it's so informative. Under the funds, you have all the funds that we operate in the district. You have an expenditure column that shows expenditures by fund and the total expenditures for this budget of $138 million. Then you have the 2 revenue columns for revenue and then tax levy, which together I've provided a note in the left-hand side there just below the total revenue of $132 million. So there's a lot of information there. Then it goes on to provide you with even more. It has the levies, it has the prior year levy and the current year levy, the change that occurs. Then it has the equalized valuation of the district from last year to this year, and shows the increase of 9.32 and 9.94. And then it has information on the levy rate itself, the gross levy rate from last year to this year. And you can see we've gone from 674 to 670 as a gross levy rate. That's a reduction of 4 cents. So that's a great thing. Now, you just heard me use the word gross levy rate. There's a reason for that. I haven't done that much in the past, just because for simplification purposes, but something happened with this biennial budget. And I want you to understand that we've always been adopting a gross levy and a gross levy rate since 1996, and I'll explain that coming up. The next slide is from pages 11 and 12 overlooked. This is the budget itself that you'll be approving subsequently in the next meeting, and it shows in the right-hand column under revenue, $96 million for the general fund, and then $101 million in expenditures for the general fund. And then I point out very clearly for disclosure that that's a projected deficit of $5.1 million. I'll be talking about this in other slides coming up and showing you the effect of this. Anyone watching this or hearing this presentation, they're going to say, what the heck? Why are you 5.1 a deficit? What's going on? Well, 6 of the last 8 years, the Wisconsin legislature did not increase our per pupil revenue limit amount. It left it at 0. And I'll be talking about that in some other slides coming up. And that cumulative effect is coming to bite us. And I was online looking at other school district budgets around the state, and I see a couple of other school districts. Waupaca says in the 3 years after what we're projecting, they're going to be at $10 million in deficit. So there are a lot of other school districts that are beginning to experience this. This is what we have for years called the fiscal cliff that was coming about because we were being shorted and they were attempting to use monies from the federal government during COVID, and of course that's one-time money. It evaporates, and then we're behind even further by the time we get out of this. So that's the situation. And the next fund was the 27 fund, and that was in balance and due to a transfer, and I'll be talking about that on some other slides. And now you're looking at the second part of that, which is the capital projects fund. There you see a decrease, revenue of $290 and expenditures of $806. That's to be expected. That's normal. We'll get that down to 0, so that's no surprise. Food service fund is in balance, trust fund is closed, and community service fund is in balance. Next slide, please. All right, we're going to see 3 slides all laid out in this same format. This comes from page 37 of your report. This is revenues. Revenue by source, semi-detailed source. And it's just breaking out that $132 million. And this is really a handy layout because across the top you see the various funds. And at the bottom of each column, you see the dollar amount for revenues for that particular fund. And in the far right-hand column, you see the $132 million. I'd like to direct your attention to the top of the chart, the table under the 20 fund. You see, I can't read it from here, but I know it says $12.4 million. All right, that's the transfer from to the 27 fund, the special education fund, and that amount represents the local cost or local share of special education. All the rest of the cost of special education is paid for either state or federal project monies. In the next 2 slides, I'm going to show you that corresponding amount that comes out of the general fund. But if you go across to the right, if you go across to the right, you'll see under the 40 fund, 135,000, I believe that is. I can't see it from here.
Yep.
But that's a small transfer amount that's going to the 49 fund, the construction fund. You remember in 2018 when we started this out, we thought we'd have to go $2.2 million into the fund balance to support the projects, but due to earned interest and a number of other factors, good prices and just a number of factors. I'm not going to go into all of them, but we performed exceptionally well, and we're only going to have to look at about 135,000. So that's fantastic. So I wanted to point that out. But then if you look further to the right, you see that those 2 numbers total up to $12.5 million. Next slide. Same format of a slide. This is expenditures. Page 38 of the budget book. This is expenditure by function, the semi-detailed function. And you can see again the budgets across the top. They form columns. The bottom of the columns are the total expenditures for each budget, each fund. And I'll draw your attention to the bottom left-hand side and go up a little bit to the number 410000. And you'll see that says interfund operating transfer, $12.5 million. So that's the functional area in the 10 fund from which that 27 fund transfer and that 135,000 fund transfer comes from. Next slide is expenditures by object. It's the same dollar amounts, same funds across the top, you'll see the same totals, the bottom of each column, but this is presented by objects, not by function. And if you look at the 800 object, you'll see it says transfers out, and you'll see it says 12.5 million. Same amount, of course it should be. So it's coming from 10 fund, 10, the 800 object, and the 410 function over to the two other funds that I just mentioned. So that's kind of how that works, and you should always see those numbers being the same among the funds so that it makes sense on the transfer in and transfer out. Next slide, please. This is the revenue limit worksheet. Because it's a worksheet, it's not contained in the budget document itself. But many of the numbers that are derived from this worksheet are in the budget, and of course they form what we must do. The two tables in yellow in the middle of this page are the 3-year rolling average numbers. 2020 to 22 is the first 3-year rolling average of about 7,000. I think it's 98 students. I can't see it from here, but then the next 3-year rolling average drops out 2020, brings in 2021, 22, and then now the new year 2023. The average of that 3-year period is 7,117 or something. And that means that our 3-year rolling average actually increased 16 FTE, which is always a good thing. Now let's look at page 2 of the revenue limit. Page 2 of the revenue limit worksheet. First thing I want to draw your attention to is the top of that yellow column. See the number $11,000? All right, that is the revenue limit, low revenue limit ceiling. You've heard that talked about several times, especially during this biennial budget cycle. And that had been $10,000 for many years, and now it's $11,000. And I'll be talking about that again on another slide coming up. Just below that, you see the numbers $325. That's the per pupil revenue limit amount. That cell right there, that $325 cell, that's the one that was zero for 6 of 8 years. We were at $10,000 as a low revenue ceiling, but our expenditures were about $10,200, $270, something like that. So that low revenue ceiling didn't mean anything to us. When they changed it to $11,000, it meant something to us because it was higher than we were at. We could raise it to $11,000, okay, which we did. Now I'll direct your attention down to the middle lower portion of the yellow where you see those two numbers, 2.9 million and 350,000. Do you see those? Okay, that is the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program and the Special Needs Scholarship Program. These numbers are put in there by the state of Wisconsin by order of the statutes. We do not control that. We are being forced to levy for this. The proceeds of this do not come to this district. We cannot use the money. The state takes it and then redistributes it to the schools that, private schools within our district that are participating in these programs. But we are forced to increase our levy by about 3.3 million by the law to do that. So I just want you to be aware of that, and I've got some slides that'll expand on that, provide you with more information as we go. Now, just to the right of those two documents, you see an arrow pointing. It says revenue limit with all exemptions. And I don't know, it's 83 million, something like that. That's our total revenue limit for this year as we calculate it on this worksheet. From that, the number right below it, the 52 million, is subtracted from that. That's our general aid. I've told you many times you take the revenue limit, subtract the general aid, and that's basically what you can levy. That's how that works. So you see a number like 31 million, 31.3 million under that. That's the revenue limit less that we can levy for the 10 and the 38 fund. 38 fund is non-referendum debt. Then from that 31.3, we go below and we take other levies from referendum debt. We add that in, and we get to the bottom where it says 42.6 million. And you see then the mill rate at the bottom, which is 670. Well, it's 0.00670, but if you put 100 in there and move the decimal over, you see $6.70. Okay? Now you see that first slide provided a lot of information because that was pretty much all on that first slide, but a little easier to understand. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, you're going to see 2-3 slides coming up. These are just informational only, but it's kind of interesting. This is the change in equalized valuation from one year to the next. And this, again, you found this on the first slide, is 9.94% was the equalized growth. I say equalized value, and a lot of people glaze over. They don't understand that term. If you interchanged fair market value or full market value, it's the same thing. But we're required to operate on full or fair market value, and it's called equalized value. TID out, by the way. Let me just take a second to explain that. TID out, sometimes people call it TIF out. In some of our municipalities, we have 18 of them. In some municipalities, they operate these tax incremental finance districts, TIFs or TIDs. And as they freeze the value of the property at the time they start that TID. And we are not allowed access to the growth in that TID as it gains value. So when we calculate our equalized valuation, we can only go with the equalized value of the municipalities with the increased TID values removed. That's called TID out. Once the TIDs are closed, then we have access to that growth. Okay, but I just kind of wanted to clarify that because sometimes we use those terms, TID and TIF, and people are going, what's he talking about? You know, so my apologies. Oh, by the way, in the back of the book, we do have acronyms. So if I use TIFs or TIDs or acronyms and you go, what is Tom talking about? If they're from the book, they'll be in there. On the very last page 65 of the book, you'll find those acronyms. Another transparency attempt and communication attempt with everybody in the public as to what we're talking about. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you have the graph, and it's very easy graphically to see that every municipality, all 18, increased in equalized value. With Whiting winning the prize this year, they almost 20% growth in equalized value. They had something turning over there that turned out pretty good. The next slide is change in levy from 22 to 23. The column in 2022, the totals are all correct across the bottom. Last year, that total of 39,010,000 is identical to 2021. If you remember those school years, they were identical. Well, we made a little mistake here when we printed this the first time. It's in the printed book wrong. The 2021 numbers within the municipalities are in that table. This has been corrected. The one you're seeing is corrected, and the one that'll be published on the website is corrected. But in the booklet, I missed it, and it shows last year's salary, but the totals are correct. So on a district-to-district basis, unless you have the updated version, and you can tell that very quickly because in the town of Sherry, it's $7,750 in that 22 column. If you see that dollar amount, you know you got the right table. Okay. Like I said, it didn't hurt anything, but it certainly would confuse some of the people from those municipalities if they looked at that. So I wanted to point that out. Next slide, please. All right, this is a real interesting one because this is a slide we use in the business office then to apportion the levy among the municipalities. If you adopt the budget and the levy this evening in the subsequent meeting, we take each one of these good. I can drink more water now.
Drink fast. It's back.
Okay. What's taking place here, and by the way, as an aside, this similar process is used when we talk about something coming up called the levy tax credits. And I just wanted you to hearken back to this when you think about this. But we've got 18 municipalities in our school district. And what takes place here is that you have the total levy of $42.6 million. And then of the equalized value of $6.3 million, each municipality has a proportional size relative to those totals. So in this case, Stevens Point is 37.98 and blah, blah, blah percent. Plover's 23.8 some percent, okay? So when we calculate their portion of the levy, we take that 37 and that 23 and then the 10 for Hull, and we apply that towards that 42 million, and we get a proportional share of the distribution so that it's a fair and equal process among all parties, and they're paying the fair share, so it doesn't matter where you live within their district, you're not paying any more or less than anybody else at the municipal level for what's taking place. As a side note, the voucher levy that I talked about in the revenue limit is included in this amount. So that almost $3 million is a part of that 42.6, okay? But as I said, I'm going to provide some additional disclosure of that. So the next slide does that. That's also on page 10, combined in with our levy, page 10 of the budget. And that just shows the 3.293 or 3.3 million. And again, this shows the same distribution methodology of how each proportional, each municipality's proportional share comes out. It's interesting to note in 2018-19 school year, the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program was $838,000 and the special needs was about 24. So added together, that wasn't even. It was about $850,000. Today, it's 3.3 million. So that's been quite an increase. I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just disclosing the numbers so that you're aware of this. This will come into play as we talk about some slides, again, coming further down the pike. Next slide, please. All right, so probably somebody says, okay, what will this budget mean for us at the local taxpayer level? This data will also be presented in combination with some stuff about a potential impact of a referendum that we'll be talking about, have been talking about and maybe be considering in the months coming up. But this is just this evening. Last year, our mill rate was $6.74. So on a $100,000 house, that computes to $674. Simple math. Our mill rate this year is $6.70. It went down 4 cents. With our increase in value of 9.95, that house then becomes $109,940. When you multiply that by 670 per thousand, you get estimated school tax, gross tax of $737, and a gross tax increase of $63. And I just want to point out too that this budget includes $6.2 million for defeasance of the 39 fund to pay principal early, and so it'll save the taxpayers pretty darn close to $3 million over the remaining amortization. So it's a really good move. It also helps us to keep the levy mill rates pretty flat as possible. Otherwise, we'd have some significant drops and spikes, and that's very disconcerting to the public, as you all know, because you've probably experienced that occasionally, but hopefully never when I've been here. Hopefully. Yeah, anyway, next slide, please. You got two slides like this. The top one says projection without referendum. The one coming up following this is going to say projection with referendum. There's a lot of information on this slide. It's a pretty interesting slide. The top section is talking about revenue, and you see 4 years of activity that have transpired in the columns, and then you see a budget column followed by 3 projection years of data. If we get into the budget column, we'll just come down, you see 96 million. Well, that's the same as you saw on the first slide and on some of the other budget slides we've gone through. And then you go down, you look at the expenditure side on the budget, you see the 101 million. That's obviously the same number that we've had on the other budget things. Then you go down and you see the negative 5.1 million. That's the deficit for that school year, okay? But this information also provides fund balance. If you look on the light blue, just below that, you see 17.9, or basically $18 million. Our funding ending balance starting this year was 23 million. If this 5.1 million comes to pass, we'll only have 18 million in our fund balance. And I need to disclose to you that we would be non-compliant with your policy, your board policy, to maintain at least 20%. This would be 18% roughly. So we would be falling down. I also want you to note there where that $5.1 million negative is. It then goes to a negative 6.3 in the following year, 7.4, 8.7, and then the year not showing it would be 10 or pretty darn close to it. But if you look at the light blue fund balances, we'd be negative fund balance in 26, 27. So we can't have this happen, obviously. So we've got to take some kind of action. So the next slide is the projection with referendum. Again, if you look at the budget column, of course, those numbers are not going to change. It's going to be the 96 revenue, the 101, and then the and expenditures and the 5.1 negative. But if you look to the right, you'll see that those numbers are all positive. For practicality, with the numbers we're talking about, that's a break even. That's a balanced budget. But if you look below that, you'll see the fund balance is being maintained at $18 million. Okay? Now I'll take this slowly. You'll understand this quickly. If we hold the fund balance at 18 million, if you look up and you see the expenditure and, for that matter, the revenue numbers, you see they're getting larger as you go to the right. That will mean that our percent of fund balance will begin to decrease. Even though we're holding the same dollar amount, the percent of the total decreases. I think the number on the far right is something like 15%. So if we do go to referendum, if we do ask for additional monies, we have to incorporate a methodology by which we take monies and build this fund balance up so that we can get just at or above that 20% figure, et cetera. Did you have a question that you wanted to, Alex?
When looking at the 23-24 budget and then the projected 24-25, looking at salaries.
Could you face me, please? Because I might.
Line 100 for salaries, it goes from 41 million to 45 million. Why are we seeing the increase of 4 million from the 23-24 to 24-25? On line 100 expenditures.
On line 100 expenditures, you're seeing 45.
41 to 58 923 for in 23-24. And then in 24-25, it goes to 45,889. Why is it a $4 million increase?
Those are projections based on certain assumptions of what salaries may or may not be. I will tell you those numbers are wrong. We just don't know the degree by which they're wrong. When this budget is going to be presented next year at this time, we'll have a more accurate number for that year, and then we'll be projecting a new 3-year period, and there'll be new sets of circumstances, and those numbers, the 25s, 26, 26, 27, will not be the same numbers you're seeing now. We'll change the projections.
Okay.
So it's just an estimate at this time. Okay. Is that what you asked for?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
Tom, when you figured the referendum, did you figure the $12 million or the $14 million?
12.
Okay.
It's a good question. The second to the last slide, I'll be talking about that. But you're ahead of me on this one. Which is good, and I don't mean that disparagingly at all. Next slide. Okay, this is something we haven't talked about, and this is how we get from gross to net. They have a thing called equalization aid and the school levy tax credits. These two are part of the 2/3 funding that the state's talked about. 1993-94 school year is when they implemented the revenue limit legislation, and that's how the state controls. They pull the strings on us, and they completely control what we can levy, and therefore they can control property tax. Okay. In 1996, they took millions of dollars out of the general aid pool and created the school levy tax credit. I remember it well. I spent several years after that going through the difference of gross and net taxes with the public and the school board to explain that. And then eventually, of course, it became root and it faded, and we didn't talk about it in those terms much anymore. Something happened this year that I need to point out to you that explains why I'm clarifying the difference between gross and net and what's going on. So if we'll go to the next slide, please. What is a school levy tax credit and how is it applied? Well, just like we use the same methodology to distribute a levy among municipalities, what the state does is they look at the statewide levies for school purposes. For the last 3 years, by municipality, they get up a total, they get the total, and then they find each municipality's proportional share of that total and multiply that times the total school levy credit available in the state. Bottom line is, the high spending school districts, communities, get the most credit from this. That's how that works. Next slide. These are two columns here. One increases the levy, the other decreases the levy. The things that involve gross levy, the per pupil revenue limit increase of $325. I pointed that line out. All right, if you put money in there, that's going to increase the revenue limit. The revenue limit ceiling, I pointed that line out to you on the revenue limit worksheet. If you're a district that's already above the $11,000, it means nothing to you. It doesn't increase. If you're below, you can increase up to it, and then eventually above it by adding the 325 or whatever is there, if any. New voucher costs, significant jumps. That's going to increase the levy, as you saw, 3.3 million. Going to increase the levy, even though we can't get it. High poverty aid, it doesn't affect this district. A successful operating referendum, of course, that's going to increase the levy. On the gross side, the thing that decreases the levy, more equalization aid. As you saw on the revenue limit worksheet, calculate our revenue limit, subtract aids. Well, if we get larger pool of general aid, it's going to be a lower amount on the levy, okay? In the green, you see the levy tax credit. That's the net. That's something that's coming up here. Next slide. Equalization aid helps property poor, low spending districts receive more state support. It brings the low property value districts up higher and gives them more money than it does the higher ones to try to equalize things and make it more fair for everyone. School levy credits benefit property wealthy and high spending districts. It's disequalizing, and they get a larger share through the levy tax credits. Next slide, please. In the next biennial budget, the one that was just passed, the state increased equalization aid by $543 million. That's great. It helped reduce property taxes. No problem. At the same time, however, they increased school levy credits by $590 million. Instead of putting that $590 into general aid as well, they put it into the levy credits. That's why tonight we're talking about the difference between gross and net. $590 million is a big chunk. So you need to see its effect. Next slide, please. This appears to be complicated. It's really not. Everything I've just talked about is under the district responsibility portion, brings us down to that middle line that's underlined. It says school district tax levy. Okay? That's the revenue limit worksheet. Everything we did here tonight brings us to that point, school district tax levy. You remember that slide where we apportion that out to the municipalities? When we apportion that out to the municipalities, we get to the bottom half of this slide, which is the municipal responsibility. And that's where the municipality takes what we apportion to them and applies a levy credit, reducing the bill to their property taxpayers in what's called the net property tax. Next slide, please. This is what it looks like on a district-wide basis. You have, in 22-23, last school year, we had a levy of $39 million. We had a school levy credit of $7 million, which brought the net levy actually to $31.9 million. Okay? This year, we've got a levy of $42.6 million. We have a levy credit of $88.7 million, so our net levy is really $33.9 million. So as you look at those different numbers, you go to the far right, our gross mill rate is $6.70. That's still a pretty good mill rate, and it's lower than a lot of other municipalities in our or other school districts in our region. But our true net levy rate, our net mill rate is $5.33. So we're really $1.37 lower than what we're seeing now. Now you see why I don't do this every year. It can be kind of complicated and confusing. But when you look at your property tax bill, you look on the upper right-hand side, maybe 2 lines down, it'll say school levy credit. It's in the book. There's a page in here that I talk about the school explaining the taxes and how that works. And you can actually see an example of a property tax bill on page 50. If you want to turn to that, go ahead. But on page 50 in block I, it says school taxes reduced by school levy tax credit, and there's a dollar amount here. So this is just an example, but this is approximately where you'll find it on your tax bill. That money is the tax credit. That's what we're looking at the board. That's already been subtracted from the tax bill. So when you go down and you look at Stevens Point School District, the tax you see there has already had that subtracted out. So on your tax bill, you're looking at the net. Okay? Now you'll see some other things where they reduce the first dollar in the lottery credit and things like that. Those are other things, but those are just a direct deduction off of that. But that's where the levy credit tax credit. I don't talk about this every year because it can be very, very confusing, especially to taxpayers. Well, what is our mill rate? What are you charging us, or what would it be, etc. So we're going to be talking about the gross levy rate of $6.70. But know that by the time it gets to the taxpayer, they're going to get about $1.6 million off of the total levy because of this levy credit. Okay. Next slide. This is the one, that I told you I would be coming to. It was your question, a good question. What is the impact of the referendum things that we've been talking about? All these numbers at the top above the first yellow row, those are all numbers from a revenue limit worksheet where we look from one year to the next, key numbers, etc. And in 2023-24, then you come down that column to as you hit the first yellow line, you see it's 670. That's the levy rate. And the levy rate before that in the prior year was 674. Okay, these numbers are becoming pretty familiar to you. Then as you go down on this worksheet, you see a levy rate change in negative 4 cents. All right, so that's a drop of 4 cents. And then you see below that the 6.2 for the defeasance. Now at the top, you see, very top, you see 7.5 million referendum amount in 24-25, and then you see in 25-26, 4.5. That's the $12 million, and it's been split between 2 years. There's a very rational reason for this. Number one, you put full 12 million in 1 year, it's going to be a heck of a hit. You're going to get a spike. We don't want that. We want to try to keep the mill rates as level as possible to minimize anxiety and hardship and a number of things. Also, there's another advantage. We're 58% aided district. So that means we get 57 to 58% back of the money that we spend in the prior year. So when we do the 6.2 million defeasance, we're going to get about 57% of that back in 24-25 to help mitigate the effect of bringing on 7.5 million. That's why it can drop 6 cents in that first year. Then in the second year, we bring on another 4.5 million, and we get 57% from that aided, and that goes up only by 14 cents. And then that takes care of the 12 million. Then we get back into the regular business in 26-27, and the mill rate's estimated to be at $6.80, which, when you think about it, last year it was $6.74. In 26-27, we're talking about $6.80. That's only 6 cents difference. So we do a $12 million referendum and have this all thing, and we're only going to be about 6 cents higher per thousand. So that's a pretty good way to lay this out. The bottom of this is like that one slide I showed you where it said, what's the effect on the homeowner? And that is last year's $674, $100,000 house, $674, and then you see the 9.94 increase, 670 times 109,940, you get 773, an increase of $63. The remaining years, the estimate used for growth is 4%. That's wrong. I don't know what it's going to be, but it's kind of close to our average. It could be more, could be less. But the impact would be $22, $47, and $35 respectively using these numbers. If I'm off twice as much, you just double those numbers. I mean, so you can play with them any way you want. But anyway, even doubling it, those are very reasonable numbers for increases. So this is showing that we could do the referendum and there'd be relatively minimal impact as a result of that. And then the next slide, we're back to this key slide and the final slide of the presentation. Again, you can see the value of all the data that's on this slide. It provides a tremendous amount of information just on one page alone. So subject to your questions, that concludes my 10-minute over the mark presentation.
Questions for Tom?
I think it's just a public hearing, so we should hold, board members should hold questions for
Okay.
the board meeting, I believe.
Okay, thank you,
I
Dr.
have a question though.
I think we hold them for the board meeting. This is just a
It
public
would-
hearing.
Could answer it real quick right now. All right. We get, our revenue limit is at 11,000 for this year, 23, 24, right? Per student?
Our revenue limit is not that amount. Our revenue limit was 83 million or whatever.
No, I mean per student.
Our per student is 11,000. That is correct.
Next year, it'll be increased by 325, or will we get
Could be.
325 this year and 325 next year?
Thank you for asking that question. I wanted to point something out, and I forgot to do so. There exists in statute at this time a law that says if you are at the low revenue ceiling or below, and we are at the low revenue ceiling because they raised it at 11,000, and you go for an operational referendum and fail it, you're locked in at that $11,000 for 3 years, unless and until you pass a subsequent operating referendum. So the answer to your question, and I got to say something else about this, and I'll come back to it, circle back, but the answer to the question, as the law stands now, if we go to referendum and fail it, we do not get the extra 325 next year. We're locked at 11, okay? Unless we pass the referendum in August, when they have the primaries, okay? Or, yeah, the primary, it'd be the... Now, there was legislation, and I think I mentioned this earlier, because I've talked about this issue with you before. There was a legislation proposed by Senator Teston and Representative Shanklin. They co-sponsored the bill. It's a bipartisan bill to repeal that law. It has subsequently passed the Senate 32-1. That's a pretty big margin and a lot of bipartisan support, which we're grateful for. I have asked Representative Shanklin's office what the status is of the co-sponsored bill in the Assembly. It's the same language. When they're going to bring it to the floor and act on it, I have not gotten a response back. So we do expect that if the Assembly passes it, it'll go to the governors, and we have no reason to believe that the governor would do anything other than approve it. So we're quite hopeful, but I wanted to tell you right out what the situation is. It's a good question. Thank you.
Okay, at this point, thank you, Dr. Owens. At this point, we will move to item 3B, public comments. We didn't have anyone that signed the sheet. Is there anyone that would like to speak? Okay, then I am looking for a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that'll adjourn this portion of the meeting. Thank you. Do we want to take a break, or no, just walk moving in? Okay.
Yep.
Shoot through it. All right, here you go. All right, so I'd like to call the Monday, October 23rd special school board meeting to order. regarding public access to meetings. This meeting is open to the public, and you're able to watch online or attend in person. Carlin, can you please call the roll?
Mr. Pope.
Here.
Mr. Campos.
Here.
Ms. Rano.
Here.
Mr. Kowalski.
Here.
Ms. Portson.
Here.
Mr. Robbie.
Here.
Ms. Erler.
Here.
Mr. Summers.
Here.
Ms. Bushman.
Here.
Quorum.
Thank you. If we stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Right, we will move into item 5A, approval of the 23-24 budget and levy. So at this point, we will take questions and comments.
I have a question. So, Tom, in the portion of the presentation that you provided that talked about, it was the slide that was the projection with referendum. So in the present that you provided.
Page 28.
Right, and it noted that in our 2023-2024 budget, and again, I understand the numbers very likely could change.
They will.
But we're looking at the potential for a reduction of our fund balance. I guess I'm looking at this projection with referendum moving out. We'd be at about 18 million from about 23 million. And then in the subsequent year, we'd be at about 18 million, and then we'd be around 18 million moving out those years. We've been operating with that 22, 23 million fund balance for quite some time. And we have been able to, we don't have to short-term borrow.
Correct.
But we get it down pretty close to zero. So I guess my question is, and again, this is the 12 million referendum. My question is, if we're at an 18 million fund balance this next year and then moving forward, are we looking at short-term borrowing?
Not yet. We would definitely be looking at short-term borrowing if we fail the referendum. Or we don't go to referendum. Then we absolutely will be looking at short-term borrowing. It may not be this year, but definitely.
But even with, I mean, are we going to be looking at? So we lower that fund balance.
Let me say a couple of things. Our fund balance, we had been at 25 million in 21-22, and the 2.2 shortfall, of course, eroded that down to 23 million. And if we get the 5 million shortfall, that takes us to the 18. When we put this budget together, I put with and without referendum in this book because of the uncertainty of what's going to happen. So I couldn't just put without referendum because that would leave you with, well, what do we do if we do? So I had to answer both questions.
Right.
Well, at least I had to address them. I don't know if I answered it, but I had to address them. Now, the other issue is I did not factor in a plan to increase the fund balance at the printing of this and the doing of this. We haven't talked internally at the cabinet level yet about some strategies to how we're going to do that. Other than the fact of what I said tonight, clearly we're going to have to take some portion of that and earmark it for that. In other words, not use it to spend it, but earmark it for that. If we go to 14 million, that becomes easier, but I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying, obviously, that's goes without saying. That's Dr. Obvious, okay? So when I put this together, I show that it's just kind of flat. Now, we were at 24% at the 23 level, but if we drop 5 million more, we're going to be at about 18%, and then it drops to 16, then 15, then the lower 15, almost 14. So And that's happening because the numbers are getting bigger and the fund balance remains the same. So we've got to have a strategy of how to get some more money in there. Otherwise, we're going to get to a point where, yeah, even with this, we get around 25, 26, maybe 26, 27, we're in a short-term borrow because now we're only at 15%. Yes.
Right. And with interest, I
Right.
just was listening to a news story today about what's happening with the federal deficit and the impact that increasing interest rates are having on that, which is, you know, we didn't have to worry about that so much when we were at
Well, that depends on,
2%,
Historic
but,
lows,
you know,
yeah.
at 5, 6, I mean, we've been very fortunate as a district to really have minimal, well, we haven't had to short-term borrow. I just want to raise that as just a looming concern that really could put us,
There's a couple
Under
of
the-
types of borrowing, and I haven't even gone in to explain that much, and I don't want to say too much about it because it gets very intricate, but there's a thing called short-term borrowing and there's a thing called arbitrage borrowing. I've done both. Short-term is basically we just borrow it for like 2 weeks to 30 days or whatever until we get a tax money in or something like that. However, depending on the rates at the time and how our debt flow, our cash flow goes, this low of a fund balance, say like 14% or whatever, could force us into arbitrage borrowing, which is borrowing money for a 13-month period, which requires 2 sets of borrowing, one borrowing under the authority of July to October, and then one on a permanent basis after this evening when you actually set the budget and the levy, and that would take us around to October, November of next year. So that gets quite more complicated because we have to go through cash flow tables on a monthly basis. That has to be done by, reviewed by bond counsel, and then we borrow money, hold it, and not pay it back for 13 months. It's a way to assist the cash flow. But again, when we're spending money for interest, that's money that's going to the banks or going to institutions or whatever for interest. It's not money that we can use to help kids, and that's the distasteful part of that. It's just not good management. If we can stay above having to borrow money, we can use the monies for kids.
thank you.
Thanks, Meg. Other questions? Okay, with that, I'm looking for a motion.
I will make a motion to approve the 2023-24 budget as shown on pages 11 and 12 of the 2023-24 budget for expenditures of all funds at $138,210,009 and revenues for all funds at $132,512,072.
Okay, motion be by Meg, second. Second by Dennis. Comments, questions on that motion? Okay, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, motion carries. Looking for another motion?
I will make a motion to approve and set the 2023-24 school levy at $42,647,083 and to authorize administration to disseminate to municipal clerks the appropriate levy certification forms.
Okay, motion made by Meg. Second? Second by Dennis. Questions, comments? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, motion carries. All right, I am looking for a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good.
Thanks, everyone.
Nice job, Tom.
Tom, you do such a good job distilling